There was an air of elegance that night at Blackwood Manor. A grand party, hosted by the illustrious businessman, Richard Blackwood, brought together the elite family and friends, and some of the most powerful names in the city. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and for a while, it seemed like just another lavish gathering in his sprawling estate. But that illusion shattered when a chilling scream pierced through the music. A guest was murdered. The celebration turned into chaos in an instant. Fear spread through the room like wildfire. Who could have done this? And why? In the midst of the panic, a voice cut through the noise. Detective Jonathan Graves, one of the invited guests, stepped forward. Without hesitation, he took charge, ordering the doors locked. No one was leaving until the killer was found. Tension filled the room. People looked around, whispering and speculating. But before anyone could process what had just happened, the lights flickered, then went out completely. A few moments of eerie silence, followed by a single horrifying sound, the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the floor. When the lights came back on, the horror deepened. Richard Blackwood, the host himself, lay lifeless on the grand marble floor. Gasps, cries, and disbelief spread across the room. He was the most powerful man here, and now he was gone. This was no random attack. The killer was still in the house, trapped along with everyone else. But who among them had the motive and the audacity to strike down not one but two people in a single night? Detective Graves wasted no time. He began his investigation, questioning the guests. And one thing quickly became clear. Almost everyone in the room had a reason to despise Richard Blackwood. Bitter business rivals, betrayed lovers, family members cast aside. The list of possible suspects grew with every revelation. But was this simply a crime of opportunity? Or was something much darker at play? Little did they know. The truth was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation deepened, so did the secrets unraveling before everyone's eyes. The guests, once poised and composed, now fidgeted under Detective Graves' scrutiny. Each had their own history with Richard Blackwood. Some had lost fortunes to him, others had their reputations ruined by his ruthless business tactics. Even his own family members weren't safe from suspicion. Then there was Blackwood's wife, Eleanor. Grief-stricken yet strangely composed. Too composed. But was it simply shock? Or something more? The air inside Blackwood Manor grew heavier by the minute. With no way out, the tension was suffocating. Accusations flew across the room. Fingers pointed at rivals, ex-lovers, disgruntled employees. Everyone wanted someone else to be guilty. But Detective Graves was methodical. He questioned each person with precision, looking for inconsistencies. And soon enough, cracks began to form in their stories. Someone was lying. And then came the first real breakthrough, a missing item. The key to Blackwood's private study had vanished. And what lay behind those doors? The answer could change everything. With no choice but to push forward, Graves forced the study doors open. Inside, a world of secrets lay in wait. Financial records, personal letters, and something even more damning. A series of documents tying Richard Blackwood to fraudulent dealings, hidden accounts, and betrayals that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. And then, the revelation that made the room go silent. Eleanor Blackwood, the grieving widow, was the beneficiary of everything. Every asset, every company, every last penny. All hers now that Richard was gone. But was she the mastermind? Or was there still another piece missing from this deadly puzzle? As the investigation deepened, the guests at Blackwood Manor were drowning in a sea of suspicion. Detective Graves combed through every alibi, every interaction, every subtle glance exchanged in the hours before the murders. What he found was unsettling. Nearly every person in that room had a reason to despise Richard Blackwood. His business partners? Betrayed. His old friends? Abandoned. His employees? Exploited. Even family members whispered of grievances that had long festered beneath the surface. But in the midst of it all, there was one person no one ever considered capable of such horror. His wife, Eleanor Blackwood. Eleanor had been inconsolable from the moment Richard's body was found. She sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to his lifeless form, refusing to let go even as the detective tried to separate her. Her grief was raw, devastating. As the hours passed and no one could leave the manor, the weight of the investigation became unbearable. Panic set in. No one knew who to trust. The accusations started small, whispers between guests, sideways glances, quiet theories. But as tensions flared, those whispers turned into full-blown arguments. People pointed fingers at former rivals, ex-lovers, disgruntled employees. The fear of being wrongly accused made them desperate to shift suspicion elsewhere. Through it all, Detective Graves remained silent, watching, observing. Eleanor Blackwood had played her part flawlessly. From the moment Richard's body hit the ground, she had been the picture of devastation. No one questioned her grief. Why would they? She had wept harder than anyone, her voice raw with anguish, her hands trembling as she clutched his lifeless form. She had lost a husband, a partner, a man she had spent years by the side of. But Detective Graves wasn't convinced. The letter he found in Richard's study revealed a side to their marriage no one had seen. Richard and Eleanor were not just husband and wife. They were partners in more ways than one. There were business dealings, secret agreements, and most disturbingly, an exchange of assets that suggested Eleanor had more control over Richard's empire than anyone realized. Had Richard been planning to cut her out? Was this about power, wealth, or was there something even deeper lurking beneath the surface? Graves knew one thing for certain. Eleanor was not the helpless widow she pretended to be. But if Eleanor had killed her husband, how had she done it without being seen? That's when Graves started looking at the timing of events. The moment the first murder occurred, the lights had gone out. Chaos had erupted. And in the confusion, no one had been keeping track of who was where. A distraction. That was all she had needed. As the long, tense hours stretched on inside Blackwood Manor, fear and paranoia thickened like a dense fog. Everyone had a motive, yet no one had a clear answer. Detective Graves had taken control, working relentlessly to dissect every detail of the murders. He questioned, observed, and led the investigation with unwavering authority. But Graves had made one miscalculation. He wasn't the only sharp mind in the room. Among the guests was Jonathan Mercer, a retired forensic analyst who had once been a lead investigator on high-profile criminal cases. He hadn't said much since the first body was discovered, content to listen, to watch, to think. And what he had been thinking troubled him deeply. Mercer leaned against the grand piano, eyes scanning the room. He observed how Graves handled the crime scenes, how he spoke, how he moved. Something wasn't right. There were too many coincidences. Too many little details Graves seemed to know before they were uncovered. Then, Mercer noticed something small but damning. When Graves lifted the host's wine glass, still sitting untouched from the party, he did so with a cloth. Careful, methodical. But when he had examined the first victim's belongings earlier that night, he hadn't shown the same caution. No gloves, no cloth. As if he knew there would be no fingerprints of the murderer to find. A simple inconsistency, but in an investigation, the smallest details were the loudest confessions. Mercer folded his arms, his voice cutting through the uneasy chatter. Detective Graves, you handled the host's glass with a cloth. You didn't do that with the first victim's items. Why? Graves turned, narrowing his eyes. Precaution, he replied coolly. Didn't want to contaminate evidence. Mercer nodded slowly. Fair enough. But it seems strange, doesn't it? A random guest is murdered and you handle evidence one way. Yet when the wealthy host is killed, you suddenly change methods? Almost like you knew which crime scene would matter more. A few heads turned toward Graves, curious, wary. But he didn't flinch. Mercer wasn't done. He walked across the room, tapping a finger against his chin. And then there's the matter of the locked doors. We all assumed the murderer had to be someone inside. That made sense, right? But let's think about something else. Who had the most control over the situation from the moment that first murder happened? Mercer took a step closer. Who was the one who ordered the doors locked? Who was the only one moving freely from room to room, collecting evidence? setting the pace of the investigation. Who knew exactly what to look for before anyone else did? The room seemed to shrink. All eyes were on Graves now. The detective smirked, shaking his head. "Are you suggesting I killed Richard Blackwood? That's absurd." Mercer's voice was calm, almost gentle. Not absurd, just logical. He picked up something from the floor, something that had gone unnoticed in the chaos. A tiny, barely there speck of ash, the kind that would come from a cigar. Richard Blackwood had smoked cigars, but there was only one other person in the house who had been seen smoking one that night, Detective Graves. And suddenly, the weight of his perfect crime began to crumble. Eleanor had thought she could trust Graves. She had believed in his plan. But now, everything started to become clear. She could feel the weight of a sinking ship. She had played her part, but she had never expected Graves to try and turn the investigation against her. So, she does the only thing she can to survive. She lets him take the fall. "You think I killed Richard?" She scoffs, tears in her eyes. "Then tell me, detective, where were you when the power went out?" That was the one moment Graves had no alibi for. And suddenly, the room isn't looking at Eleanor anymore. "You were going to betray me?" Eleanor asked. The whole room was filled with confusion. Eleanor knew all evidence against Faulkner would turn against her, but she was never going to go down alone. She was determined to ruin Graves as well. She had spent the entire night in tears, loud, unrestrained, almost unbearable sobs. No one blamed her. After all, she had just lost her husband. But no one ever thought to suspect her. Why would they? She was too devastated, too shattered. And yet, that grief hid a terrible secret. It started with an argument, a heated, vicious fight between Eleanor and one of the guests, a man named Harold Faulkner. He wasn't just a guest. He was Richard Blackwood's oldest friend. And more than that, he was the one who had been poisoning Richard's mind against his own wife. Eleanor had found out. She had confronted him in the study, demanding to know why he was turning her husband against her. The fight escalated. Harsh words were exchanged. Threats were made. And in a blind moment of rage, it happened. One push, one sickening crack as Harold's skull hit the marble fireplace. She had killed him, accidentally. But what came after was no accident. Her husband, Richard, had seen everything. He had rushed in, horror-stricken, and reached for the telephone to call the police. But before he could, Detective Graves stepped out of the shadows. He had been standing there, watching, thinking, and then, without hesitation, he killed Richard. It wasn't to protect Eleanor. No, Graves had no such loyalty. He had plans, long, careful, well-calculated plans to steal from Richard Blackwood. He had been working on this for months, waiting for the perfect moment. But if Richard had called the police, everything would have fallen apart. He couldn't allow that. So he made a decision, a brutal, irreversible decision. One corpse became two. The guests had heard the commotion, and soon after, Graves had no choice but to become what he did best, a detective. He led the investigation, twisted it to his favor, and controlled the narrative. He tampered with evidence. He handled Richard's belongings with a cloth, staged scenes just enough to plant suspicion elsewhere. He wanted Eleanor to take the fall, and he almost got away with it. Eleanor's lips trembled. "You were going to let me rot in prison." Graves said nothing, but the guilt was already written across his face. And then Eleanor screamed, wild, raw, broken. She crumbled onto the floor, sobbing, shaking. Graves had just dug his own grave. He was a dirty cop, but this time he had no escape.